Hi. Hello. Happy Tuesday. And we're going to read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. We're going to get through 3 chapters tonight, which is absolutely crazy. But we're going to do it so that in our next stream, we can have our big finale tomorrow. Tomorrow will be our big finale at about this same time. I'm going to get on around 9 to do the finale of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This has been such a journey, but okay, we'll get into that tomorrow. Until then, we got 3 chapters to get through, so I'm going to jump right in right now. This first chapter is called The Squid. For some days, the Nautilus kept well away from the American coast. Evidently, she did not wish to enter the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean. It was not that the water in those parts would have lacked depth, since their average depth of those seas is well over 5,500 feet. It was more likely that many ships in the area would have made Captain Nemo very uncomfortable. On the 16th of April, we sighted Martinique and Guadeloupe, about 30 miles away. For a few moments, I had a glimpse of their highest peaks. The Canadian who had planned to make our escape in the Gulf, either by reaching land or by being picked up by one of the many ships that sailed between the islands, was very disappointed. To escape would have been perfectly possible if Ned Land could have taken possession of the dinghy unbeknown to the captain. But since we were out in mid-ocean, the idea had to be given up. Hi, Colina. The Canadian, Conseil, and I had a fairly long conversation on the subject. We had been prisoners on board the Nautilus for 6 months. We had traveled 17,000 leagues. We're getting to 20. As Ned Land pointed out, there seemed to be a reason to think that it would never come to an end. He made a proposal that I had not expected. He proposed that we ask Captain Nemo point blank whether or not he intended to keep us on board indefinitely. Such a step, however, did not appeal to me, for in my opinion, this would be useless. Our hopes lay not in the captain of the Nautilus, but only in ourselves. For some time, moreover, he had become more moody, more reserved, less sociable. He seemed to avoid me. I saw him only on rare occasions. In the past, he had enjoyed explaining the wonders of the underwater world to me. Now he left me to my studies and no longer came into the saloon. What was the reason for this change of attitude toward me? I had done nothing to reproach myself for. Did our presence on board begin to disturb him? Whatever it was, there was no reason to hope that he would give us our freedom. I asked Ned to give me time to think the matter over before doing anything, because if this step failed, it could rekindle the captain's suspicions, make our situation very unpleasant, and this would hamper any plan the Canadian had in mind. I may add that we could not possibly use our health as an excuse, for with the exception of that trying ordeal under the ice barrier, the 3 of us had never felt better. The wholesome food, the invigorating air, the regular hours, and a uniform temperature made us less susceptible to illness. For a man who had forsaken life on land as Captain Nemo had done, for a man who had felt at home at sea, free to come and go as he pleased, who lived and followed paths shrouded in misery to achieve a goal of his own choosing. An existence such as his was understandable. But we were not broken with humanity, nor had I, who had been doing such interesting explorations under the sea, any wish to have these studies die with me. I was now in a position to write a definitive work, and I wanted this work sooner or later to see the light of day. Meanwhile, in the waters of the West Indies, 30 feet or so below the surface, with panels open, how many interesting things passed before my eyes. Day after day, things I entered in my notes. Among other zoophytes, I observed some galleys, or Portuguese men of war, known as Falagia pelagia, a kind of fat and oblong swimming bladder with a tint of mother of pearl, holding up their membrane in the wind and letting their blue tentacles float like silk threads on the water. Lovely medusae to the eye, but corrosive, poisonous nettles to the touch. Among the articulata, there were annelids or sea worms, about 5 feet long, armed with a pink horn and equipped with 1,700 organs of locomotion, meandering under the surface, reflecting all the colors of the rainbow in passing. Among the numerous fish, I saw some devilfish, enormous cartilaginous fish, 10 feet long, weighing 600 pounds, with triangular pectoral fins, a slightly humped back, and eyes set at an extreme rear of the head. They were floating in the water like wrecked ships, and sometimes they covered our panels like heavy shutters. There were American triggerfish, which nature had colored only in white and black, a kind of goby with long, fleshy bodies, yellow fins, and a protruding jaw, mackerel about 6 feet long, with short, sharp teeth, their bodies covered with small scales, belonging to the albacore series. Then we observed swarms of gray mullet, with golden stripes running head to tail, splashing around with their resplendent fins. These masterpieces of jewelry were only considered sacred to Diana and were particularly sought after by wealthy Romans. There was a proverb about them by wealthy Romans. Wait. There was a proverb about them that said, "Let them who catches them not eat them." Finally, we saw golden pomacanthae decorated with emerald bands, dressed in velvet and silks, swimming before us. Colpidae, 15 inches long, immersed in their own phosphorescent glow. Common mullet, beating the sea with large, plump tails. Red corrigoni, which seemed to be moving the waves with sharp pectoral fin. And silver selines, or moonfish, worthy of their name, rising to the horizon of the waters like so many moons, reflecting pale rays. How many other marvelous new specimens I might have observed if the Nautilus was not gradually dived down into deeper waters. With inclined fins, she took us down to 6,600 and even to 11,500 feet. At such depths, animal life was represented only by sea lilies, starfish, lovely pentacrins with medusa heads, their straight stalks bearing a little chalice, some trochee, some bleeding teeth, and some fissuralis, or keyhole limpets, coastal mollusks, and of a huge species. On April 20th, we had risen to an average depth of about 5,000 feet. The nearest land was an archipelago of the Bahamas, spread out like so many paving stones on the surface of the water. There were tall cliffs under the water, great perpendicular walls formed by some block blocks arranged like bricks, between which there were dark holes into which the beams of our searchlight could not fully reach. These rocks were carpeted by a large species of seaweed, giant laminae with endless fuci, a veritable triangle of hydrophytes worthy of a world of titans. In talking about these huge plants, Conseil, Ned, and I naturally fell to discussing the gigantic animals of the sea, for this vegetation was obviously intended as food for them. However, as I looked through the panels of the Nautilus, which were now almost motionless, I could see among those long filaments nothing but the principal articulata of the division of branchiopods, long-legged purple-blue crabs, and cleos, or sea butterflies, found in the Antilles. It was about 7 o'clock when Ned Land drew my attention to a great wriggling and squirming movement among those tall seaweeds. "Well," I said, "those are probably caves inhabited by squids, and I should not be at all surprised to see a few of those monsters." "What?" exclaimed Conseil. "Ordinary squids of the class of cephalots?" "No," I said. "I mean giant squid. But friend Land has probably made a mistake because I did not see anything." "I'm sorry about that," replied Conseil. "I should like to come face to face with one of those squids I've heard so much about, which can drag whole ships down into the deep. Those animals are called crack will do," retorted the Canadian sarcastically. "Krakens," rejoined Conseil, getting his word in without heeding his companion's quip. "You'll never make me believe that such creatures exist," said Ned Land. "Why not?" replied Conseil. "Why believe in the existence of Monsieur's narwhal, didn't we?" "And we were wrong, Conseil." "That's true, but there are people who still believe in it." "I shouldn't be a bit surprised," I said to Conseil. "But as far as I am concerned, I have decided not to admit the existence of these monsters until I have dissected them with my own hand." "Does Monsieur mean that he does not believe in the existence of giant squid?" Conseil asked me. "Who in the devil has ever believed in them anyway?" exclaimed the Canadian. "Oh, many people, Ned. Not fishermen. Scientists, perhaps." "You are wrong, Ned. Fishermen and scientists." "But let me tell you," said Conseil, in a most serious tone of voice, "I can remember clearly seeing a large ship dragged down beneath the waves by the tentacles of a cephalod." "Do you mean you actually saw that?" asked the Canadian. "Yes, Ned." "With your own eyes?" "With my own eyes." "Did you mind telling me where?" "At St. Malo," Conseil replied, without batting an eye. "In the harbor, I suppose?" Ned Land asked ironically. "No, in a church," replied Conseil. "In a church?" replied the Canadian. "Yes, my friend, in a painting that represented the squid in question." "That's a good one," said Ned Land, laughing. "Monsieur Conseil is pulling my leg, monsieur." "As a matter of fact," I said, "he is right. I have heard about that painting. But the subject is based on a legend, and you know what legends are worth when it comes to natural history. When it is a question of monsters, there is no limit to the flight of the imagination. Not only has it been alleged that these squids could drag ships down beneath the waves, but a certain Olus Magnus mentions a cephalod 1 mile long that looked more like an island than an animal. Another tale relates that the bishop of Nidros one day set up an altar on a large rock. Once the mass was over, the rock began to move and return to the sea. That rock was a giant squid. "Is that all?" asked the Canadian. "No," I replied. "Another bishop, Ponto Pippidin of Berghem also speaks of a fish of which it was possible to maneuver the regiment of cavalry. Those bishops of old were pretty good at telling tall tales, said Ned Land. Lastly, the naturalists of ancient times referred to monsters whose mouths were as big as the Gulf. They were too big to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar. Well, can you beat that? Exclaimed the Canadian. But is there any truth? But is there any truth in those tales? Exclaimed Conseil. No, my friends. At least for those which excuse the bounds of probability and became fables or legends. However, the storytellers require at least a pretext if there exists a species of octopus or cuttlefish of great size, and they are not as big as the whales. Aristotle reported seeing a squid 5 cubits long, that is, over 10 feet in length. Our fishermen often see those see whose length exceeds 5 feet. The museums of Tricité and Montpellier have some skeletons of octopi measuring over 6 feet. Furthermore, naturalists have calculated that if one of those creatures were only 6 feet long, it would have tentacles 27 feet in length, which is quite a formidable monster. Do fishermen fish them these days? If they do not fish for them, sailors nevertheless come across them. One of my friends, Captain Paul Bos Le Havre, has told me that he met one of those huge monsters in the Indian Ocean. But the astonishing incident, which makes it impossible any longer to doubt the existence of these gigantic creatures, happened a few years ago, in 1861. What happened? Said Ned Land. Well, in 1861, northeast of Tenerife, at about the same latitude as we are at this moment, the crew of the dispatch boat Alcaton saw a monstrous squid swimming near it. Captain Bouguerar approached the creature and attacked it with harpoons and gunfire, but without much success, since the bullets and the harpoons just passed through a soft flesh, as they might have passed through a soft belly. After several fruitless attempts, the crew succeeded in passing a slip knot around the body of a mollusk. The knot slipped down the rope as far as the caudal fins and stopped. An attempt was made to haul the monster aboard, but its weight was so great that the rope cut through the body and severed its tail. The creature, minus its tail, disappeared under the water. Well, at least we have some facts, said Ned Land. An indisputable fact, my good Ned. Not only that, but it was actually suggested that this animal be called Borger's Island. How long was it? Wasn't it about 20 feet long? Said Conseil, who, standing at the window, was again examining the rugged outlines of the cliffs. Precisely, I replied. And wasn't it its head crowned with 8 tentacles that splashed in the water like a nest of snakes? Quite right. And weren't the eyes huge and set near the top of its head? Exactly. And wasn't it mouth, just like an enormous parrot's beak? Indeed it was, Conseil. Well, if Monsieur doesn't mind me asking so, Conseil said calmly, if what I'm looking at is not Borger's squid, it must be one of its brothers. I looked at Conseil, and Ned Land sprang toward the window. What a horrible monster! He exclaimed. I looked also. I could not repress a feeling of repulsion. Before my eyes there wriggled a terrible monster, worthy to figure among all the legends of these creatures. It was a squid of colossal dimensions, about 25 feet long. It was moving backward at a great speed in the direction of the Nautilus, peering through enormous blue green eyes. Its 8 arms, or rather its 8 tentacles, set in its head, which is why it's called a cephalod, were twice as long as its body and swirled about like the air of Furies. One could distinctly see the 250 suckers on the inner surface of the tentacles, shaped like semicircular capsules. Sometimes these air holes or suckers could stick to the panel of the saloon, creating a vacuum. The mouth of that monster, a horny beak, shaped like that of a parrot, opened and closed with a vertical motion. Its tongue, also horny in texture and armed with several rows of sharp teeth, vibrated in and out between the blades of those shears. What a fantastic creature of nature! A bird's beak in a mollusk, its tapering body, bulbous in the middle, formed a fleshy mass that must have weighed 40 to 50,000 pounds. Its color changed with incredible speed, from a livid gray to a reddish brown, depending on the mood of the beast. What was irritating that monster? Doubtless, it was the presence of the Nautilus, more formidable than it, on which neither its suckers nor its jaws could gain any hold. And yet, the fabulous monster these squids are, what vitality the Creator had given them, what vigor in their movements, propelled as they are by 3 hearts. Wow, that's so cool. Chance had brought us into the presence of this animal, and I did not want to miss the opportunity to make a careful study of this specimen of a cephalod. I overcame the horror by which its appearance filled me, and taking a pencil, I began to draw it. Perhaps this is the same monster that got away from the Alcaton, said Conseil. No, it can't be, replied the Canadian. This one is intact. He hasn't lost its tail. That does not mean anything, I interjected. The tentacles and tail of this creature can grow again by a process of regeneration, and Borker's squid must certainly have had time to grow a new tail in the past 7 years. Anyway, said Ned, if this isn't the one, perhaps it's one of those over there. Indeed, other squids were appearing on the starboard window. I counted 7 of them wriggling around the Nautilus. I could hear them grinding their beaks against the iron plates of our hull. We could not have wished for more. I continued my work. The monsters were sticking so close to us that they scarcely seemed to be moving, and I could have traced an outline of them on the window pane. Furthermore, our speed was quite slow. Suddenly, the Nautilus stopped, and a shock made her whole structure tremble. Have we run into something? I asked. If that is the case, replied the Canadian, we are free again, because we are floating. The Nautilus was certainly afloat, it is true, but she was no longer moving. Her propeller was no longer beating the water. A minute went by, and then Captain Nemo, following by his lieutenant, came into the saloon. I was so curious about when Captain Nemo was going to come back. I don't know why he's been avoiding them, but I'm glad he's back. I had not seen him for some time, and he seemed depressed. Without speaking to us, perhaps without having seen us, he went to the panel, took a good look at the squids, and said a few words to his second in command. The first mate left the room. Soon the panels were closed and the ceiling lights came on. I went over to the captain. This is a curious collection of squids, I said in a non-committal tone, like some amateur who had just been looking through the glass of an aquarium. Yes, indeed, monsieur, he replied. We will soon come to grips with them. I stared at the captain, scarcely believing my ears. Come to grips with them? I repeated. Yes, monsieur. The propellers have stopped, and I imagine that the horny jaws of one of these animals are wrapped around the vanes, which is preventing us from moving. What do you propose we do? Surface and massacre these vermin. A rather difficult thing to do. That is true. Our electric bullets are powerless against that soft flesh because they do not find enough resistance to explode. We'll have to go at them with our axes. And with a harpoon, sir, added the Canadian, if you'll permit me to help. I will accept your offer, Master Land. We will go with you, I said, and following Captain Nemo, we made our way toward the central staircase. There, about 10 or 12 men, armed with boarding axes, were all ready for the attack. Conseil and I each took an axe, while Ned Land took a harpoon. The Nautilus had surfaced by then. One of the sailors at the top of the steps was unscrewing the bolts of the hatch. But hardly had the bolts been freed when the hatch shot up with great force, obviously pulled up by the suckers of a squid's tentacle. Immediately, one of those long tentacles came sliding through the opening like a serpent, while 20 others flailed about overhead. With one blow from his axe, Captain Nemo cut through the formidable tentacle, which slithered, squirming down the steps. We pushed forward, one behind the other, to get onto the platform. 2 other tentacles came snaking down through the air, grabbed the sailor standing in front of Captain Nemo, and pulled him upward with irresistible force. Captain Nemo gave a shout and rushed on deck. We rushed behind him. What a scene! The poor man, in the grip of that tentacle, held fast by its suckers, was dangling in the air at the mercy of that enormous arm. He was gasping, choking, and kept shouting, "Help! Help!" I was astounded to hear those words spoken in French. So I had a compatriot on board, perhaps several. I shall remember his heartening cry till the end of my days. The poor fellow was lost. Who could save him from that powerful grip? Nevertheless, Captain Nemo had rushed at the squid, and with one blow of his axe had hacked off another of its tentacles. I'm confused. Wait. The sailor standing in front of... Okay, so it's just a random sailor on board that's caught by a giant squid. This is insane. The second in command was battling furiously with other monsters, which were climbing up the sides of the Nautilus. The whole crew was battling furiously. The Canadian, Conseil, and I were sinking our weapons into that fleshy mass. A strong smell of musk filled the air. It was horrible. For a moment, I thought that the unfortunate man entangled in the clutches of the squid would be freed from those powerful suckers. 7 of the 8 tentacles had been cut off. The remaining one brandished the victim, dangled in the air like a feather. But just as Captain Nemo had his lieutenant plunged at it, the animal threw up a jet of black liquid, and these animals secrete in a sac of the abdomen. We were blinded by it. When the black cloud had cleared away, the squid had disappeared, and with it my unfortunate fellow countryman. What an incredible fury we attacked those monsters. We fought like men possessed. 10 or 12 of these creatures had now swarmed over to the deck and sides of the Nautilus. We hurled ourselves pell-mell into that mass of truncated tentacles that squirmed like serpents all over the platform in the midst of the deluge of blood and black ink. Like Hydra's head, those slimy arms seemed to grow back almost instantly. Okay, that's wild. um, there's no way that's real. I'm sorry. Um, Ned Land's harpoon plunged and pierced the greenish eyes of those creatures, but my bold companion was suddenly thrown on his back by the tentacles of a monster he could not avoid. Why had my heart not stopped beating with emotion and horror? The huge jaws of that monster had been opened over Ned Land. The poor man was about to be cut in two. I sprang to his aid, but Captain Nemo was quicker than I, and with one blow buried his axe between the two formidable jaws of that creature. Saved by a miracle, the Canadian sprang to his feet and plunged his harpoon into the triple heart of that monster. I owed you that, said Captain Nemo to the Canadian. Ned bowed his head without answering. The battle had lasted a quarter of an hour. The monsters, defeated, mutilated, or slaughtered, finally gave way and disappeared beneath the waves. Captain Nemo, spattered with blood, stood motionless beside the searchlight, gazing at the sea that had just swallowed one of his companions. Tears streamed down his face. That chapter was intense as hell. Holy crap. There was a literal fight with a giant squid. That was crazy. Man, Jules Verne, right at the end of the book, he's like, let's have them almost die by asphyxiation. Let's have them get stuck under a sheet of ice and almost die. And let's have them all be endangered by an attack of a giant squid that kills one of the sailors. How about that? Does that sound good? This is a book for children, by the way. Like, what? That was crazy. Chapter XIX, also known as 19, the Gulf Stream. None of us will ever forget that horrible scene which took place on the 20th of April. 420, what's up? Sorry. When I wrote about it immediately after its occurrence, I was still under the influence of violent emotions. I went over its details later and read it to Conceal and the Canadian. They agreed that the facts were accurate, but they thought I had failed to convey the emotional drama of the situation. But to describe the scenes adequately, one would require the gift of the most illustrious of our poets, the author of The Travelers de la Mer, Victor Hugo. I described how Captain Nemo had wept as he gazed at those waters below him. His sorrow had been deep and sincere. This was the second companion he had lost since he had come aboard. What a horrible death. His friend had been crushed, stilted, and torn into pieces by the powerful arms of that monstrous squid, crushed by its iron jaws. Never would he lie in a peaceful grave with his companions in those tranquil waters of that coral cemetery. The cry of despair uttered by the unfortunate victim of the midst of that battle had torn my heart. That poor Frenchman, forgetting the strange language used on the board, had turned again to the language of his country and his mother to express the last desperate call for help. It's so sad. Among the crew of the Nautilus, bound body and soul for Captain Nemo, and like him, having renounced all contact with mankind, there was a fellow countryman of mine. Was he the only Frenchman in that mysterious brotherhood, obviously made up of men of different nationalities? This was another insoluble problem that constantly haunted my mind. Captain Nemo returned to his room, and I did not see him again for some time. How sad, how depressed, and irre- irresolute he must have been, if I had to judge from his ship, of which he was moving spirit had faithfully reflected his every mood. The Nautilus was no longer keeping to a set course, but was drifting here and there, like a corpse at the mercy of the waves. Although the propeller had been disentangled and freed, it was scarcely used. The Canadian cruised at random. The captain, cruised at random, unable to tear himself away from the scene of that last fight, from those waters that had swallowed one of his men. 10 days passed in that manner, and it was not until the 1st of May that the Nautilus took a definite course toward the north, after having sighted the Bahamas at the mouth of the Bahama Channel. We were now following the largest current in the sea, a veritable river that had its own banks, its fish, and its own temperature. I mean, of course, the Gulf Stream. This is a current that flows smoothly in the middle of the Atlantic, without its waters becoming mixed with those of the ocean. It is a salty stream, saltier than the surrounding sea. Its average depth is 3,000 feet, and its average width is 60 miles. In some places, its current flows at a speed of about 2.5 miles an hour. The constant volume of its waters is greater than that of all the rivers in the world put together. The true source of the Gulf Stream discovered by Commander Maury, its point of departure, if you will, is situated in the Bay of Biscay. There its waters, which are still low in temperature and somewhat colorless, begin to take form. The stream flows south along the equatorial Africa, is warmed by the torrid rays of the tropical sun, crosses the Atlantic, reaches Cape San Roque on the Brazilian coast, and splits into two branches, one of which flows under the warmer waters of the Caribbean. Then the Gulf Stream, whose task it is to restore the balance between the extremes of temperature and to mix the tropical with the northern waters, begins to its stabilizing role. Brought to a white heat in the Gulf of Mexico, it flows northward along the American coast as long as Newfoundland, and deflected by the cold current from the Davis Strait, then resumes its oceanic route by following a rum line, and divides into two branches in the region of the 43rd panel, one of which, helped by the northeast trade winds, returns to the Bay of Biscay and the Azores, while the other, after having warmed the waters around the coast of Ireland and Norway, meanders up to Spitzenberg, where the temperature drops to 4 degrees centigrade, or 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and empties into the polar seas. It was in this ocean current that the Nautilus was now navigating. On leaving the Bahama Channel, which is 30 miles wide and more than 1,000 feet deep, the Gulf Stream flows at about 5 miles an hour. This speed decreases steadily as it goes north, and it must be hoped that this regular trend will persist. For should its speed and direction be changed, the climate of Europe would undergo an upheaval of incalculable consequences. At about midday, I was on the platform with Conseil. I was initiating him into the mysteries of that Gulf Stream. When I was through with my explanations, I asked him to put his hands in the water. Conseil obeyed, and was very surprised to feel no sensation of cold or heat. The reason for that, I told him, is that the temperature of the Gulf Stream, as it leaves the Gulf of Mexico, differs very little from that of the human body. The Gulf Stream is a vast distributor of warmth, which enables the coast of Europe to be continually decked in green. If one is to believe Maury, the heat of its current, if it were fully exploited, would supply enough warmth to prevent a river of molten metal as big as the Amazon or the Missouri from solidifying. At that moment, the speed of the Gulf Stream was about 7 feet a second. Its current was so different from that of the surrounding sea, and its waters were so compressed that they actually rise higher to the surface. Oh, sorry, rise higher than the surrounding ocean, so that there is a difference in level between it and the cold sea. And its waters are so compressed that they actually rise higher. Oh wait, I already read this. Surrounding ocean for a difference in the level between it and the cold sea. The waters of the Gulf Stream are dark in color and rich in salts. Their pure indigo color makes them stand out from the green water surrounding them. So clear is the line of that demarcation that the Nautilus, when she was level with the Carolinas, had to prow in the Gulf Stream while her propeller was still beating the water of the Atlantic. This current carried with it a whole world of living creatures. Argonauts, so common in the Mediterranean, were seen in great numbers. While the cartilaginous fish, the, among the cartilaginous fish, the most remarkable were rays, whose tails formed almost 1/3 of their body, which were shaped like huge diamonds, about 25 feet long. There were also small sharks, about a yard long, with large heads, short, round muzzles, and several rows of sharp teeth, whose bodies seemed to be covered with scales. Among the bony fish, I noticed some gray wrasse, peculiar to those waters, a certain kind of black gilthead whose iris shone like fire, cyanidae, or croakers, a yard long, with large snouts set with many little teeth, which uttered soft cries. Black centrinote, which I have already mentioned. Dolphins, or blue coryphenes speckled with gold and silver. Parrotfish, veritable rainbows of the ocean that can rival the most beautiful tropic birds in color. Blunnies with triangular heads, bluish roms or garfish without scales, toadfish with yellow stripes shaped like a Greek T, masses of little gobies with brown spotted bodies, dipterodons with silver heads and yellow tails, several species of salmon, gray mullets and slender bodies, shining with the soft gray which Lacopede dedicated to his wife. And finally, a lovely fish, the American horseman, covered with medals and ribbons, which is found in the waters of that great nation where medals and ribbons are so little esteemed. I must add that during the night, the phosphorescent waters of the Gulf Stream rivaled the electric glow of our searchlight, especially during that stormy weather that was constantly threatening us. On the 8th of May, we were passing Cape Hatteras, parallel with North Carolina. The breadth of the Gulf Stream is at a point of 75 miles, while its depth is about 700 feet. The Nautilus continued to cruise aimlessly. There seemed to be no supervision on board. Indeed, I had to agree that under such conditions, there seemed to be every chance of a successful escape, since these inhabited shores would be offered easy refuge. The sea was crisscrossed continuously by numerous steamers plying between New York or Boston or the Gulf of Mexico, and frequently, day and night, by little coastal craft, was called at various points on the American coast. There was therefore every hope of being picked up, and the opportunity to escape appeared to be good, in spite of the 30 miles separating the Nautilus from the coast of the United States. But an unfortunate circumstance made the Canadians' plans impracticable. The weather was very bad. We were approaching an area where storms were frequent, the homes of water spouts, and cyclones caused by the Gulf Stream itself. To brave an idea that was often whipped into turmoil in a fragile dinghy was to risk certain death. Even Ned Land agreed. Nevertheless, he was champing at the bit, tortured by a furious nostalgia that only an escape could cure. "Professor," he said to me one day, "that business has got to come to an end. I want to be clear about this. Your Captain Nemo is leaving the land behind and sailing toward the north. But let me tell you that I had enough of the South Pole and won't follow him to the North Pole. But what can we do, Ned? Since an escape is out of the question at present, we must reconsider my last plan. We must speak to the captain. You didn't say a word when we were in your home waters. But now that we are in mine, I'm going to talk. When I think that within several days the Nautilus will be off Nova Scotia, where a large bay opens toward Newfoundland, where St. Lawrence empties into the bay, and St. Lawrence is my river, a river that flows by Quebec, my homeland. When I think of this, I am overcome with fury, and my hair stands on end. No, monsieur, I'd rather jump in the sea. I can't stand this any longer. I'm suffocating." Obviously, the Canadian was at an end of his patience. His energetic temperament could no longer be put up with. This long imprisonment, his face was changing day by day. His mood was becoming worse. I realized that he must be suffering, and I too was beginning to feel homesick. Nearly 7 months had passed without our having any news from the outside world. Moreover, Captain Nemo's self-imposed isolation had his changed attitude, especially since the battle in the Squids, his silence, all this made me see things in a different light. I no longer felt the same enthusiasm as I had felt in the beginning. One had to be a Fleming, like Conseil, to accept such a situation and live in surroundings reserved for Cretians and other inhabitants of the deep. Really, if that worthy young man had been equipped with gills instead of lungs, he would have made for an excellent fish. "Well, Professor?" asked Ned Land, when I did not reply. "Well, Ned, do you want me to ask Captain Nemo what his intentions are regarding us?" "Yes, monsieur. Even though he has already made it clear to us?" "Yes, I want to be certain once and for all. Speak only for me, and me alone, if you want to." "But I do not see him very often. He avoids me now." "All the more reason to go and see him." "All right, Ned. I will ask him." "When?" insisted the Canadian. "When I see him." "Monsieur Arenat, do you want me to go and look for him?" "No, let me do it. Tomorrow." "No, today," said Ned Land. "All right, then, today," I replied. "I do not want him to spoil everything for all of us." The Canadian left me. Once I had decided to ask the captain, I was determined to do so at once and have done with it. I prefer to have things done rather than leaving them to be done. I returned to my room. I could hear Captain Nemo's steps in his own cabin. I must not lose this opportunity to broach the matter. I knocked at his door. There was no answer. I knocked again and turned the knob. The door opened. I entered. The captain was there, bent over his work table. He had not heard me. Since I was determined not to leave without having questioned him, I walked straight up to him. He raised his head suddenly, frowned, and said to me somewhat rudely, "What are you doing here? What do you want?" I want to speak to you, Captain. But I am busy, Professor. I am working. Why not grant me the same freedom I grant you, the freedom to be alone? The reception was not very encouraging, but I was determined to be patient and see the matter through. Captain, I said coldly, I have already spoken to you of a matter I would no longer like to put off. That I can no longer put off. What matter, Professor? He replied ironically. Have you made some discovery that has escaped my attention? Has the sea revealed some new secrets to you? Evidently, we were not thinking the same thing. But before I could reply, he showed me a manuscript lying open on his table, and said to me in a more serious tone of voice, Here, Monsieur Arenat, we have a manuscript written in several languages. It contains a summary of all my studies on the sea. God willing, it shall not perish with me. The manuscript, signed by me, including the story of my life, will be sealed in a small, unsinkable container. The last man of us to survive on board the Nautilus will throw it into the sea, and it will drift wherever the waves may carry it. Signed in his own name, with his life story written by himself, did this mean that his secret would one day be revealed? But for the moment, I only saw this as an excuse for broaching the subject. Captain, I replied, I find it impossible not to approve this idea of yours. The fruits of your study must not be lost, but the means that you employ seem to me primitive. Who can tell where the winds may blow your container and in whose hands it may fall? Could you not find a better solution? Could you not, or one of your men? Never, Professor, said the captain emphatically, interrupting me. But I and my companions are prepared to treat your manuscript in confidence, and it will give us our liberty. Your liberty, exclaimed Captain Nemo, getting up. Yes, Captain, that is precisely what I have come to talk to you about. For the past 7 months, we have been on board your ship, and I want to ask you today, in the name of my companions and myself, whether it is your intention to keep us here forever. Monsieur Arenat, said Captain Nemo, I will tell you today, and what I told you some months ago. Whoever enters the Nautilus must never leave her. But this is slavery that you are imposing on us. Call it whatever you like. But everywhere a slave has a right to regain his liberty, and any means he may use to escape are justified. Who has denied you that right? Replied Captain Nemo. Have I tried to bind you with an oath? As he spoke, the captain looked at me and folded his arms. Monsieur, I said, let us go back once more to the subject which is more painful to both of us. Let us discuss and settle it once and for all. You know very well that I am not the only one concerned in this matter. You are well aware that my studies here are of deep interest to me. This is such an intense part. Oh my God, I'm like so in it. This book, it's easy to zone out, you know? Sorry, Jules Verne. Like it's just old, you know? But the end of the book, you can tell how attached the author has become to the characters, and also to the idea of giving us suspense and excitement like right at the end. So yeah, it's like this moment here is just so intense. I'm like, yeah, all right, I'll keep going. But it's like what we've been waiting for the whole book, right? Like it feels so climactic. Anyway. Okay. I'm going to restart this paragraph. Monsieur, I said, let us go back once more to a subject that is somewhat painful for both of us. Let us discuss and settle it once and for all. You know very well that I am not the only one concerned in this matter. You are well aware that my studies here are of deep interest to me. They are not only a great pleasure and diversion to me, but also a passion that can make me forget everything else. Like you, I am not a man who is seeking recognition and renown. I can live in obscurity, and like you, nurture only a frail hope that some day in the future the fruits of my labors may be discovered by means of a hypothetical container entrusted to the hazards of the wind and the waves. I can and do admire you. I can even follow in your footsteps with pleasure, but only in the aspects of your life which are understandable to me. There are, however, other aspects which we find difficult to understand and are unable to share. On occasions, we have been touched to the heart by your sorrows. On others, we have been stirred by your deeds of genius and courage. Of these occasions, we have had to suppress even the slightest token of sympathy and admiration which a human being feels in the presence of something noble and good. Whether it come from a friend or a foe, it is a feeling that we are alien to all that affects you closely, that makes our situation somewhat unacceptable and impossible even for me, but especially for Ned Land. Every man, for the very fact that he is a man, deserves some consideration. Have you ever asked yourself what a love of liberty or hatred of slavery can do to endanger vengeance in a man like Ned Land? Have you ever thought what he might think, what he might try or attempt to do? I paused. Captain Nemo got up. Ned Land can think, try, or attempt whatever he wishes, but it does not matter to me. It is not I who sought him out, nor am I keeping him on board for my pleasure. As far as you are concerned, Monsieur Aronnax, you are a man capable of understanding everything, even silence. I have nothing more to say. Let this be the first and last time for you to come and discuss this matter with me. I will refuse to utter another word on this subject. I withdrew. From that day on, our situation was very tense. I reported this conversation to my two companions. Now we know that we can't expect anything from him, said Ned Land. The Nautilus is approaching Long Island, and we'll make a break for it no matter what the weather is like. The sky was becoming more and more threatening. Signs of a hurricane appeared in the sky. The whole atmosphere was turning into a grayish-white color. On the horizon, layers of cirrus and cumulus clouds were gathering. Accumulation like mountains in the background, while low clouds sped by swiftly around us. The waves rose higher and higher, swelling into long, rough breakers. The birds disappeared, except those lovers of tempests and petrels. The barometer dropped noticeably, indicating an extreme tension in the air. The mixture in the storm glass was decomposing rapidly due to the electric energy that saturated the atmosphere. All the elements were ready to unleash their fury. The storm broke on the 18th of May, just when the Nautilus was sailing off Long Island, only a few miles from the entrance of the New York harbor. I can describe this fury of the elements, for instead of taking refuge in the depths of the sea, Captain Nemo, by some inexplicable whim, decided to brave the storm on the surface. A very strong wind was blowing from the southwest and at almost 40 miles an hour. By 3 in the afternoon, it had reached a speed of 50 miles an hour, the speed of a tempest. Captain Nemo, imperturbable despite the storm, had taken up his position on the platform. He had had a rope fastened around his waist and had himself tied fast so that he could stand up on the monstrous waves. I had done the same, my admiration divided between the storm and that incomparable man who could brave it. The raging sea was swept by great billows of clouds, which dipped to the waves as they passed. I could no longer see those smaller intermediate waves that form in the hollow of large ones. Nothing was visible except those murky undulations, whose crests were so compact that they never broke. They kept getting higher and higher, urging each other on with fury. The Nautilus, sometimes lying on her side, sometimes standing up like a mast, rolled and pitched frightfully. At about 5 o'clock, the rain began to come down in torrents, but neither the wind nor the sea abated. The hurricane was now blowing at a speed of about 150 feet per second, or about 100 miles an hour. At such a speed, it can overturn homes, drive roofing tiles through wooden doors, tear iron gratings, and move 24-pound cannons. But the Nautilus, in the turmoil of that storm, justified the command of an eminent engineer who stated that there is no well-constructed hull that cannot defy the sea. Our ship was not a solid, sturdy rock that the storm could have demolished. It was more than that. It was rather a spindle built of steel that neither masts nor rigging, mobile or maneuverable, which could brave the fury of the sea with impunity. Meanwhile, I carefully examined those raging waves. They measured as much as 50 feet in height and up to 500 or 600 feet in breadth, and they were running about 50 feet a second, about half the speed of the wind. The volume of their force increased with the depth of the water. Now I realized my role that these waves play in the scheme of nature. They capture air and force it down to the bottom of the sea, where its oxygen nurtures life. Their pressure, it had been calculated, can rise to as much as 6,500 pounds per square foot on any surface they strike. In the Hebrides, waves like this once moved a block of stone weighing 84,000 pounds. In the hurricane on the 23rd of December, 1864, after having destroyed part of Tokyo, the waves traveled across the Pacific and broke on that same day against the shores of America. The intensity of the storm increased with the coming of night. The barometer fell to 28 inches, just as it had during the cyclone that struck Réunion in 1860. As night was falling, I saw a large vessel struggling painfully along the horizon. It was moving at reduced speed, trying to stay afloat. It was probably one of those steamers that ply between New York and Liverpool or Le Havre. It soon disappeared in the darkness. By 10 o'clock that night, the sky was on fire. The heavens had streaked with flashes of lightning. I could not take the dazzling flashes, but Captain Nemo stared them in the face, appearing to inhale the soul of that tempest. Ah, what a beautiful line. My God. I could not take the dazzling flashes, but Captain Nemo stared them in the face, appearing to inhale the soul of that tempest. Wow. The air was rent by horrible noises, made by the crashing of the waves, the howling of the wind, and the claps of thunder. The wind seemed to come from all directions, and the cyclone, rising in the east, whirled north, east, and south, moving counterclockwise, just the opposite of storms in the southern hemisphere, whose winds was clockwise. Ah, the Gulf Stream! How well it justified its name of King of the Tempests, for it is the cause of these formidable cyclones, created by the difference in temperature between its waters and the layers of air above them. The rain was followed by showers of fire. Raindrops were transformed into sparkles of lightning. One would have thought that Captain Nemo, seeking a death worthy of him, sought to be struck by lightning. With a fearful, pitching movement, the Nautilus reared in the air, and with her spur pointed upward like a lightning rod, with flashes of lightning shooting from it. Completely exhausted, I crawled on my stomach toward the hatch, opened it, and went down into the saloon. The storm was then reaching its greatest violence. It was impossible to stand up inside the Nautilus. The Captain Nemo came in at about midnight. I heard the tanks of the Nautilus being filled slowly, and she sank gently below the surface. Through the open panels of the saloon, I saw large fish, frightened by the storm, shooting by like ghosts through the fiery waters. Some of them were struck dead by lightning before my very eyes. The Nautilus kept submerging. I thought it would find calm waters at a depth of 50 feet, but I was mistaken. The storm above was churning too violently for that. We had to dive to 150 feet into the bowels of the sea before we found peace. How quiet, silent, and peaceful it was there. Who would have thought that a frightful hurricane was unleashing its fury on the surface of the sea at that very moment? Okay. All right, that was chapter 19. Time to jump into this chapter 20 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is 9 pages, so slightly shorter than what we just read. The storm had driven us eastward again, and all hope of escape on the shores around New York or on St. Lawrence vanished. In his despair, poor Ned had withdrawn into himself, and like Captain Nemo, sought solitude. Conseil and I no longer left each other. I have said that the Nautilus had been driven eastward. To be more exact, I should have said northward. I should have said northeast. For some days it cruised aimlessly, sometimes on the surface, sometimes submerged, in the midst of those fogs so dangerous to sailors. Those fogs are caused primarily by melting ice, which saturates the atmosphere with moisture. How many ships have been lost in these waters while seeking to reach the uncertain and dim lights on the coast? How many calamities had these heavy fogs have caused? How many wrecks occur on the reefs whose noisy breakers are drowned by the winds? How many collisions have taken place in spite of lights, foghorns, and bells? For this reason, the seabed of the area looked like a battlefield, a burial ground, where lay all the victims vanquished by the sea. Some were already old and encrusted. Others, more recent, still reflected the glare of our searchlight on the iron and copper of their hulls. How many of those ships had sunk with all hands on board, including immigrants, around those points marked dangerous on the mariners' charts? Cape Race, St. Paul Island, Belle Isle Strait, and the statuary of St. Lawrence. Just in the past few years, how many victims have been entered in the funeral annals of the Royal Mail of Inman and of Montreal, the Solway, the Iris, the Parramatta, the Hungarian, the Canadian, the Anglo-Saxon, the Humboldt, and the United States, all run aground, the Arctic, the Linnaeus, struck by collisions, the President, the Pacific, the city of Glasgow, fate unknown, dismal remains, among which the Nautilus cruised as if passing in review a parade of the dead. On the 15th of May, we reached the southernmost tip of the Grand Break of Newfoundland. I can't read the words the 15th of May without thinking of Seussical, and my inner theater kid just like jumps out for a second and is like, on the 15th of May, in the jungle of Newell, in the heat of the day, in the cool of the pool. But anyway, sorry. Um Okay, this bank is the product of alluvia, or great masses of organic matter, brought either from the equator of the Gulf Stream or from the North Pole by the countercurrent of the cold water that skirts the American coast. There are also huge masses of rocks dropped there by the breaking up of ice. It also has a vast ossuary of fish, mollusks, and zoophytes that have perished there by the million. The depth of the sea is not very great at the Grand Bank, no more than a few hundred fathoms at most. But toward the south there is a deep depression, a pit about 10,000 feet deep. It loses both its speed and some of its warmth and becomes virtually a sea. Among the fish that the Nautilus frightened away as she cruised along, I would mention the Cyclophorus lumpus, or lump fish, 3 feet long with a blackish back and an orange belly, which gives other fish a seldom followed example of marital fidelity. What's a large unnernack, a kind of emerald moray, excellent to eat. Carax, with big eyes and a head shaped like that of a god. Blunnies, oviparous like the reptiles. Black gobies, or gudgeons, about an inch long. Garriners with large tails and a brilliant silver sheen, all fast swimming, that had ventured far from their northern seas. The nets also brought up a hardy, bold, vigorous fish with strong muscles, that armed with prickled nettles on its head and spurs on its fins. A real scorpion, 6 or 10 feet long, with a deadly enemy of blennies, codfish, and salmon. It was the bullhead of the northern seas, with a brown, gnarled body and red fins. The men of the Nautilus had some trouble with this animal, which, thanks to the formation of gills, can prevent its lungs from drying when exposed to the open air, and can thus live for some time out of the water. The nets also brought up a hardy, bold, vigorous fish, with strong muscles and armed with prickling nettles on its head and spurs on its fins. A deadly scorpion, 6 or 10 feet long, with a deadly enemy of blennies, codfish, and salmon. It was the bullhead of the northern sea, with a brown, gnarled body and red fins. The men of the Nautilus had some trouble with this animal, which, thanks to the formation of its gills, can prevent its lungs from drying when exposed to the open air and can thus live for some time out of the water. Just as a reminder, I will cite boscians, little fish that follow ships for a long time in the northern seas, sharp-snouted beaks peculiar to the North Atlantic, hogfish, and finally, the gadae, represented by their main species, the cod, which I was able to observe in its favorite waters, the inexhaustible Great Bank of Newfoundland. One could well call the cod a mountain fish, for Newfoundland is just that, a submerged mountain. As the Nautilus made its way through massive ranks of the cod, Conseil could not restrain himself. You know, I never knew what Newfoundland was. I had never even like heard that term before, really, or didn't know of it geographically until I started doing a lot of research on the life of Amelia Earhart, and she would like stop her plane, or I think on one of her really big flights, she had a stop in Newfoundland, and then I started hearing about it all the time, like reading Amelia Earhart memoirs and like biographies and stuff. I just keep thinking of her when we come across that word. One could well call the cod a mountain fish. Oh, wait, I already read that. What are those cods? But I thought cods were flat like flounders or soles. How naive can you be? I cried. Cod is only flat at a grocery store when they are opened and spread out. But in the water they are spindle shaped as mullets and perfectly built for speed. I believe whatsoever Monsieur says, replied Conseil. But what masses? What swarms? Well, my friend, I can only say that there must be many more if it were not in the emergencies. The enemies, the hogfish and man. Do you know how many eggs have been counted in one single female? Let us be generous, replied the Conseil. 500,000? 11 million, my friend. 11 million? I refuse to believe that unless I count them myself. Go ahead and count them, Conseil, but it would be quicker to believe me. Remember that cod is fished by Frenchmen, Englishmen, Americans, Danes, and Norwegians, who catch them by the thousands. They are submerged in prodigious quantities, and if it were not for their astounding fertility, the seas would soon be stripped of all supply. In England and America alone, 5,000 ships, manned by 75,000 fishermen, are engaged in cod fishing. Each ship has an average catch of 40,000, which adds up to a total of 25 million. We have the same figures from Norway. All right, replied Conseil. I'll take Monsieur's word for it. I won't count them. You will not count what? Those 11 million eggs. I should like to point out one thing, however. What is that? If all those eggs hatched, 4 female cods would supply England, America, and Norway. As we moved across the bottom of the Great Bank, I could clearly see those long fishing lines, each carrying 200 hooks, which every boat pulls by the dozen. Each line was held down by a small grappling cork buoy. The Nautilus had to do some skillful steering to get through that underwater network. We did not stay long in these crowded waters. We cruised north toward the 42nd parallel, off St. John of Newfoundland and the Heart's Content, where the Atlantic cable ends. Instead of continuing northward, the Nautilus then turned east, as if she wished to follow the plateau on which the telegraphic cable was laid, where numerous soundings had given an accurate map of the ocean floor. It was on the 17th of May, about 500 miles from Hart. I read this. No, I didn't. It was the 17th of May, about 500 miles from the Heart's content, that a depth of about 9,000 feet, that I first saw the cable lying on the ocean floor. Conseil, whom I had not forewarned, at first thought it was a gigantic sea serpent, and was ready to classify it, following his usual methods. However, I set him straight, and to console him for his blunder, I gave him some details about the laying of the cable. The first cable was laid during the years 1857 and 1858, but after having transmitted about 400 telegrams, it ceased to function. In 1863, the engineers constructed a new cable, measuring over 2,000 miles in length and weighing 4,500 tons, which was loaded aboard the Great Eastern, but that attempt also failed. The Nautilus, on May 25th, submerged at a depth of 12,500 feet, passed over the very spot where the break of the cable had occurred, ruining the earlier project. This spot was 638 miles from the coast of Ireland. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it was noticed that the communications with Europe had been interrupted. The electricians on board decided to cut the cable before bringing it to the surface, and at 11 o'clock in the evening they had recovered the broken part. They repaired it by splicing it, and then the cable was let down once more. A few days later, however, it snapped again, and this time it could not be recovered from the ocean depths. The Americans did not lose heart, however. The audacious Cyrus Field, promoter of that enterprise, who was risking his entire fortune, announced a new series of bonds, which were immediately brought up. The bundles of electric wires were insulated by a casing of gutta percha, which in turn was protected by pads of textile patterns, and all inserted in a metal casing. The Great Eastern set sail again on the 13th of July, 1866. On the 23rd of July, the Great Eastern was only 500 miles from Newfoundland when she received a telegram from Ireland stating that an armistice had been signed between Austria and Prussia after the Battle of Sadowa. On July 27th, in a thick fog, she reached Heart's Content. The enterprise had been brought to a successful conclusion, and the first message young America sent to old Europe consisted of these wide words, so rarely understood: Glory to God in heaven, peace on earth to all men of good will. I did not expect to find the cable in its original state, such as it was if I had left the factory. That long serpent, covered with shells and encrusted with formidable Farah, was, however, still embedded with a kind of rocky cement that protected it from mollusks that might bore into it. There it lay, peacefully, sheltered from the movement of the sea and subjected to a pressure favorable to the transmission of the electric impulse that travels from America to Europe in 32 hundredths of a second. Doubtless the cable will last indefinitely, for it has been noted that the sheath of gutta percha is improved when immersed in salt water. Moreover, on this well-chosen underwater plateau, the cable is never lowered at depths that will cause a break. The Nautilus followed it to its lowest depth, 14,500 feet down, where it lay without any danger of breaking. Then we approached the spot where the accident had taken place in 1863. The floor of the ocean in that place consisted of a valley of 75 miles wide and deep enough to contain Mont Blanc without its peak rising above the surface. This valley is closed off to the east by a perpendicular wall of about 6,000 feet. We reached this point on the 28th of May, and the Nautilus was no more than 100 miles from Ireland. Did Captain Nemo intend to sail northward and head for the British Isles? No. Much to my surprise, he turned south toward the European waters. As we sailed around the Emerald Isle, I caught a glimpse of Cape Clear and the Fastnet Lighthouse, which lights the way for thousands of ships leaving Glasgow or Liverpool. I feel like Captain Nemo's gonna die. I think I got a spoiler about that. So that'll be interesting. He's not dead yet, so the author is really waiting for that last minute. Maybe he's not gonna die. I just feel like I saw a chapter title that alluded to death. An important question now occurred to me. Would the Nautilus venture into the English Channel? Ned Land, who had reappeared as we approached coastal waters, kept asking me questions. I did not know what to tell him. Captain Nemo was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, the Nautilus continued south. On May 30th, she cruised within sight of Land's End, between the southernmost tip of England and the Scilly Isles, where she was left to starboard. If he intended to enter the channel, he would now have to veer sharply to the east, but he did not do so. Throughout the day, on May 31st, the Nautilus kept cruising in a series of circles, which intrigued me. She seemed to be searching for a certain spot and was having difficulty in locating it. At midday, Captain Nemo himself came out to take our bearings. He paid no attention to me, and he seemed to be more depressed than ever. What could be the reason for that depressed mood? Was it because he was approaching eastern shores? Was he moved by memories of his forsaken land? What did he really feel? Was it remorse or regrets that moved him? This thought occupied my mind for a long time, and I had a presentiment that fate would soon betray the captain's secrets. The next day, June 1st, the Nautilus continued to cruise around in circles. It was obvious that she was looking for a definite spot in the sea. Captain Nemo measured the height of the sun just as he had done the day before. The sea was calm, the sky clear. About 8 miles to eastward, a big steamer was outlined against the horizon. She flew no flag, and I could not tell her nationality. A few minutes before the sun passed its zenith, Captain Nemo took up the sextant and peered through it with great care. The sun was perfectly calm and facilitated his task. The Nautilus lay motionless, neither rolling nor pitching. I was still on the platform when the captain finished his observations. I heard him say only a few words. "This it is." Then he went down the hatch. Had he seen the ship, which was now altering its course and seemed to be speeding toward us? I could not say. I went back to the saloon. The hatch was closed, and I heard the sound of water hissing into the tanks. The Nautilus began to submerge straight down, vertically. Its propellers had stopped turning. A few minutes later, it stopped at a depth about 2,700 feet and lay motionless at the bed of the sea. Then the lights of the saloon were switched off, the panels were opened, and through the panes I could clearly see the sea, brilliantly lit by the beam of our searchlight for a radius of half a mile. I looked to port, but could see nothing but an endless expanse of tranquil water. To starboard in the distance, however, my attention was attracted by something large and bulky, suggestive of ruins burned beneath a coat of whitish shells resembling a mantle of snow. On taking a closer look at the mass, I thought I could make out the warped structure of a ship, stripped of its mass, which must have sunk downward. The wreck had certainly occurred a long time ago. To be so encrusted with calcareous matter, it must be lain on the ocean bottom for many, many years. What ship was it? Why had the Nautilus come to visit its tomb? Had something other than a shipwreck been the cause of its disappearance beneath the waters? I was just wondering about this when the captain, who was standing next to me, said in a slow, measured voice, "This ship was once called the Marseillaise. She was launched in 1762, and her armament consisted of 74 guns. On the 13th of August, 1778, under the command of Admiral d'Estaing, on the 5th of September, 1781, she participated in the Battle of Chesapeake Bay with Count de Glace. On 1794, the French Republic changed her name. On April 16th of the same year, she joined abreast the squadron of Villerete Joyeuse, who had ordered an escort to escort a decoy of wheat from America under the command of Admiral Bond's Stable. On the 11th, on the 12th of the year 2, this squadron countered some English ships. Today, monsieur, is the 13th Pardigal. The first day of June, 1868. 74 years ago, to the very day, at this very spot, at latitude 47 degrees 24 minutes, and longitude 17 degrees 28 minutes, the ship, after putting up a heroic fight, lost all 3 of her masts, with water pouring into the holds of this third of her crew out in action, preferred to be swallowed by the sea, with her 356 men, rather than surrender. With her flag nailed to the poop, she disappeared beneath the waves to the cries of "Long live the Republic!" "The Avenger!" I exclaimed. "Yes, monsieur, the Avenger. A wonderful name," murmured Captain Nemo, crossing his arms. And with that, we have finished chapter 20 of part 2 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. We made it, y'all. We did it, Joe. And with that, we are so close to the end. We are going to finish the book in tomorrow's stream. And I will see you very soon. And thanks for being here. All right. Good night.